The inside of the long-abandoned gas station was dark. The floor was dotted with trash, beer bottles, cigarette butts, and other junk. Someone, probably the police, had cleared a path through the trash from the front door to the hallway on my left. It was a pathway that was used by crime scene techs and detectives after the girl's body had been found. Now, the place was quiet. All the work had been done, the evidence collected. The only police officer around was sitting outside in a squad car, making sure no one could get into the crime scene. But I had gotten in. I wasn't a detective. I had no experience in solving murders. So why the hell was I standing here? It was a ridiculous notion. I needed to walk outside and turn myself in. I was a murderer, after all. I'd killed a man. It was just a matter of time before I was caught. Maybe I would get some leniency for giving myself up. But part of me was scared of going to prison, scared of how my wife and daughter would look at me when they learned what I'd done. So I decided to have a look around the decrepit gas station. I was already here, after all. I pulled out the burner phone I'd bought and activated the screen, casting pale blue light around. I was standing near the back of the station, with the counter on my right and the hallway to the bathrooms on my left. The windows and front doors were boarded up, the glass panels long since smashed out. Picking my way toward the cleared path, I looked for anything that could be considered a clue. Of course, I found nothing. Sighing, I walked down the hall and looked in the women's bathroom. Nothing of interest, just 2 stalls, empty liquor bottles, and cigarette butts. The same thing in the men's room, except there was only 1 stall and 1 urinal. The last room before the rear exit was the office. I pushed the door open and shined the dim blue light from the phone inside.
Jesus Christ!
The words rushed out of me as I saw the state of the office. There was dried blood all over the floor, but it was the walls that caught my attention. There were letters all over the walls, and they were written in blood.
Murderer! Murderer!
The woman's voice echoed in my head. It had been 2 years since she'd screamed that word at me repeatedly as I left the courthouse. 2 years since I'd even seen that woman. But I could still hear her voice as clearly as if she were standing 10 feet away, yelling at me. I was in the middle of replacing a thermostat on an 8410T John Deere tractor, but I had to pause to look around, half expecting to see the woman in the shop. Of course, she wasn't there. She moved across the country after the jury in the court case ruled in my favor. Still, my heart rate was up and I felt a vague queasiness in my stomach, all brought on by my memory of the woman, the accident, and the terrible time trying to deal with what had happened. Lev came around the side of the Deere, wiping his hands on his shop towel. Our eyes met, and my coworker paused. He had a very Eastern European look to him, with the high cheekbones and the angular face. He was a short guy, about 5'7", with fair hair and light green eyes. He'd been working at the shop for about a year, and we'd become pretty good friends. Some of the guys in town hated him just because he was from Russia, which I couldn't understand. I'd always been one to judge a person by their actions. I really didn't give a damn where anyone was from or what they looked like, as long as they weren't an asshole and treated others with respect. And Lev certainly wasn't an asshole. He treated everyone with respect, even those guys in town who gave him shit.
You look like you need a break,
Lev said, speaking in his heavy Russian accent.
Yeah, okay,
I said, stepping away from the tractor and grabbing my shop towel from the back pocket of my coveralls. We walked outside into the back parking lot of the tractor repair shop. The sky was clear, the spring sun shining down, the birds chirping. Lev produced a pack of cigarettes and offered me one. I shook my head. He smiled before finishing a smoke and putting it between his lips.
How long?
He asked.
Just over 6 months this time,
I said, not even tempted to take one of the cancer sticks.
Good for you, good. How you say, discipline?
Yup, discipline. I said. I inhaled the fresh air as Lev lit his cigarette. And, as I was certain would happen, the conversation soon turned to the biggest news to hit Greenbrier since my accident 2 years ago. Murder. But it wasn't just any murder. Not the kind you heard about on the news. The kind that happened in some other place, far away. No, this murder happened not 2 miles from the home my wife and I were still 20 years away from paying off. The murder happened in my community, to a teenage girl my daughter's age, a classmate of my daughter. This murder happened in a community where murders didn't ever happen. The girl's name was Misha Brodowski, and she was 15 years old when she went missing from her home over on Birch Street. Her little brother was the last person to see her alive. According to the kid, Misha was getting into a silver sedan that could have been a Nissan, Toyota, or Mazda. He said that the windows were tinted and the sun was shining in such a way that he couldn't see the driver. He couldn't tell whether it was a man or a woman. Of course, this didn't seem strange to him at first. Just Big Sister going out with some of her friends. He didn't recognize the car, but he didn't think much of it. Not until Misha didn't come home that night, and she didn't answer the phone when her parents called her. Only when it was clear something was wrong did the kid tell his parents what he'd seen. They called the police soon after. The police did the best they could, asking the public for tips and putting one of their 2 detectives on the case. 3 days later, someone called in an anonymous tip, saying they'd seen a silver sedan pull into a long abandoned gas station on the south side of town on the day Misha disappeared. When the police looked into the station, they found Misha's body inside. They refused to release any details, only that Misha had been murdered. But one of the patrol officers who discovered the body later let slip that he'd thrown up upon seeing what the murderer had done to the poor girl. That was all the details the public got. Then, 3 days later, the police released a grainy photograph of a white man wearing a brown jacket and khaki pants, strolling toward a silver sedan parked at the abandoned gas station. The photo had been taken from video, recorded on a truck driver's dash cam as he drove past the abandoned station on the day of the murder. Given the source and how much they had to blow up the picture to get a good view of the man, there wasn't much you could tell about the guy. Although you could see, faintly, that his pants looked as if they were splashed with blood. He wore a black baseball cap, hiding the top half of his face. The bottom half was obscured by a brown beard. The way the sedan had been parked, backed in against the building, made it impossible to see the license plate. But authorities were fairly certain it was a Mazda, even though you couldn't really tell from the picture. They had the entire video from the dash cam, but they weren't ready to release any more of it for some reason. After this bit of information was released, everyone in the community thought that they would catch the guy soon, but they didn't. A week passed. No arrests were made. The police assured everyone that they were working hard to find the killer. Lev and I talked about who could do such a thing. He told me a story about a man who killed 2 little girls in his small Russian hometown. Said that when they caught the guy, a mob stormed into the police station and dragged him out. He was beaten to death by the 2 girls' parents. It wasn't exactly a story I wanted to hear, but that was one thing about Lev. He seemed to have a bleak outlook on life, despite seeming like a relatively happy guy. Maybe it had something to do with being Russian. I wasn't sure. Just as he was down to the last half-inch of cigarette, a dark blue SUV rolled into the parking lot. As Lev looked at it, his face fell. Without a word, he flicked the cigarette butt away and headed over to the vehicle, which was idling next to the employee parking row. I watched the driver step out. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man who immediately got in Lev's face. I could hear that they were speaking in Russian, so I had no idea what they were saying. The driver spoke for a while, towering over Lev, poking him in the chest every so often. Then it was Lev's turn to speak, and he did so without ever looking the other man in the eye. I got the feeling he was apologizing for something, but it was just a guess. After the driver said a few more words, he got back into the SUV and drove away. Lev came back over, digging another cigarette out of his pack with shaking hands.
What was that about?
I asked as he lit the cigarette. Lev shook his head.
Nothing. Russian things. You Americans would not understand.
I could tell by his tone that he wasn't kidding, but I persisted.
You in some kind of trouble? Need a loan or something?
Lev looked at me as if seeing me for the first time since he'd come back over from the SUV. He smiled.
No, Carter. Thank you. You are a good friend. Very good friend.
I shrugged.
Well, let me know if you need any help.
I headed back inside and got back to work. An hour passed before work was interrupted again. Only this time, the whole shop stopped. As always, we had the radio on in the garage. I had a habit of tuning it out when there wasn't music on. So when someone turned up the radio loud, I stopped to see what all the fuss was about. And when the words sunk in, I felt a swirl of anger and despair invade my body. Another girl had been found dead. Another girl from our community. This time, it was a 13-year-old girl named Andy Lorraine. I immediately wiped my hands on a shop towel and called my wife, Bethany. She picked up on the third ring.
Have you heard?
I asked.
Heard what?
Another girl was killed. Andy Lorraine. Have you heard from Lily today?
Oh my god, that's terrible. What is happening to this town?
Have you heard from Lily today?
Yes, I talked to her at lunch, like always. You know, Carter, you can always call your daughter if you want to see if she's okay.
Isn't she in class right now?
It's 3:05, babe. She's out of school for the day. Give her a call if you want to check on her. She'll appreciate it.
Okay,
I said.
I will. See you tonight.
I hung up without waiting for Bethany's reply. Ever since the murder of Misha, I'd been having nightmares about my daughter Lily getting abducted and killed. I couldn't imagine what Misha's parents were going through. And now Andy Lorraine's. I called my daughter. Her phone rang. And rang. And went to voicemail.
Hey, it's your dad. Please give me a call back when you get this. Or at least, send me a text to let me know where you are and what you're doing.
I hung up after leaving the message and stared at my phone for a few long moments. Sudden visions flashed through my head. Lily screaming while a man held her down. Lily crying while a man stabbed her. Lily begging for her life while a man... I pushed the thoughts away and got back to work, but I struggled to focus. Even after Lily texted me back, telling me that she was at home doing homework, I still couldn't focus. And 6 o'clock came about as slow as a slug crossing a 6-lane highway.
I can't believe they haven't caught the guy yet,
I said while my wife and I lay in bed in the dark.
Can we not talk about this again? I don't want to go to sleep with it in my head. Right,
I said.
Sorry.
I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. It had been 5 days since the murder of the second girl, Andy Lorraine. While the first murder hadn't garnered much more than local attention, the second girl's death brought a circus to town. Not long after the police announced that a second girl had been murdered, they also announced that they believed it was the same perpetrator responsible for both. That meant a serial killer. And there's nothing the true crime community loves more than a serial killer. I had been increasingly on edge for the last 5 days. I couldn't seem to stop my mind from going to dark places, picturing my daughter getting abducted and murdered. I'd been walking around feeling constantly sick, waiting for something terrible to happen. To make matters worse, people seemed to stare at me whenever I went out in public. Maybe it was because I was the last person associated with the young girl's death in our town. It was the last time anything like this had happened, even if my situation was completely different. Still, every time someone looked at me, as if remembering the whole drama surrounding my case, I heard the woman's voice in my head again. I heard her shouting, "Murderer!" at me in her shrill voice, like a crow cawing. On top of that was my concern for my daughter. At my wife's urging, I had managed to keep my instincts under control.
You can't watch her every hour of every day,
Bethany had told me.
She's a smart girl. She knows what to do if some strange man approaches her.
Other than setting some basic rules to keep Lily safe, we hadn't done much to be proactive about the killer. I thought we weren't doing nearly enough. Bethany thought otherwise. And with each day that passed without an arrest, the more trouble I had getting to sleep at night. I found myself staring at the ceiling for longer and longer stretches each night. Now, as I looked through the gloom, I knew sleep wouldn't be coming anytime soon. When I thought my wife was asleep, I crept out of the room and went down the hall of our modest one-story house to check on Lily. She was asleep in her bed. I then went and checked all the doors and windows. I went back to the bedroom and retrieved my small lockbox from the closet, taking it to the home office Bethany and I shared. Sitting at my desk, I opened the lockbox. Inside was a Smith & Wesson 9mm pistol. It was loaded and ready to go. I'd made sure of this after I heard about the first murder. Setting the unlocked box aside, I powered my laptop and launched Spotify. I selected an episode from one of the many true crime podcasts that had been covering the case since the second murder. The title of the episode was The Greenbrier Ghoul. I didn't much care for the name. It gave the killer a supernatural connotation that ignited a low-key anger inside me. But I knew how the media loved to come up with catchy names for serial killers. After inserting my earbuds, I listened to the entire episode, taking notes. At the end of the episode, I went to check on Lily again. When I was sure she was okay, I headed back to the home office and listened to another episode from a different podcast. There were some things I hadn't heard before, things about the latest murder. I knew the second girl, Andy Lorraine, had been found in an old rundown trailer home on a piece of land that had been for sale for months. While the gas station for Misha's murder was on the south side of town, the trailer was on the north side. In fact, according to the second podcast that I listened to, if you looked at the two locations on a map, you could draw a perfectly straight north-south line from one to the other, right through the center of town. I thought that particular piece of evidence was a coincidence, if it was even true. I didn't deem it relevant enough to verify. But that same podcast mentioned the fact that the state police superintendent, a man named Ronald Jeffers, had shown up in our little town shortly after the first murder. That seemed strange to me, just as it seemed strange to the podcast hosts. After all, no one knew it was a serial killing then, did they? It made sense for Jeffers to show up once it was clear there was a serial killer in our town, but not before. If he showed up after every murder in our state, he would never get anything else done. But then I thought that maybe the police knew something the public didn't. Maybe something at the crime scene gave them an indication that it was a serial killer. If that was the case, they certainly wouldn't tell the public it was a possibility. I couldn't help but wonder, if they had told us, would Andy Lorraine be alive now? By the time that second episode was done, it was past midnight, and I was still wide awake. I didn't think I would be able to sleep at all, so I stayed up, thinking more and more about who could have killed those two innocent girls. Most of everyone seemed to think that it was a local, or at least someone highly familiar with the area. Our town wasn't on a major highway. It was mostly people who lived in the area who used the roads going past the gas station and the property with the old trailer. I spent the rest of the night listening to podcasts, watching news reports on YouTube, and writing notes down in a notebook. I even brainstormed some names of people who looked like the grainy picture of the guy at the old gas station. Before I knew it, the sun was up and someone was tapping me on the shoulder. I spun around in my office chair, pulling out my earbuds as I did so. It was Bethany. She looked at me with concern.
Did you stay up all night?
I couldn't sleep. She looked at my computer screen.
So you what? Watched YouTube videos about the murders all night?
Noticing the time, I shut the laptop and stood up, ignoring my wife's question.
Has Lily left yet? She's about to,
Bethany said.
Why?
I'm going to drive her.
Carter, it's a 10-minute walk. I'm sure she'll be fine.
I'm sure that's what Misha Brodowski's parents said. And Andy Lorraine's. I'm not taking the chance. Not until the sicko is caught.
I walked into the hall, seeing that the bathroom door was closed.
Lily, don't leave yet. I'm going to drive you to school.
That's okay, Dad.
She called from the bathroom.
I'll walk.
It's not up for discussion.
Whoa, Carter,
Bethany said.
why are you yelling? Calm down. Sorry,
I said, face flushing.
must be the lack of sleep.
Bethany looked at me for a long moment, brow furrowed.
Apologize to your daughter.
I nodded, gathered myself, and then walked up to the bathroom door.
Sorry for yelling, Lily,
I said.
but I will be taking you to school until they catch whoever is killing teenage girls. Just give me a few minutes to get ready.
Fine.
Lily said from inside the bathroom. I was headed to work after dropping Lily off at school when I saw a silver Mazda sedan with tinted windows at a stoplight up ahead. I eased my truck to a stop in the left lane, a couple of car lengths behind the Mazda, which was in the right lane waiting for the light to turn. I peered toward the sedan, trying to get a glimpse of the person driving it. The windows were too dark. The light turned. Traffic flowed ahead. On a whim, I got into the right lane and decided to follow the Mazda. If I could get a glimpse of the driver, maybe I could rule them out as the murderer. Perhaps it was a woman or an old man. The Mazda continued down Center Street. I followed, staying 1 or 2 car lengths behind the whole time. I glanced down the road that led to my job as I passed through the intersection. The tractor repair place was a mile to my left. At the very least, I was going to be late. But this was more important, not only for my daughter, but for all the young girls in this town. So I kept going. The Mazda pulled into a shopping center. I followed, pulling into a parking spot near the back so I could see where the car was going. It parked about 100 yards away. The door opened. A middle-aged man stepped out, wearing a cheap suit and sporting a bushy brown mustache. He walked across the lot and entered a farmer's insurance office. I took the opportunity to write down the Mazda's license plate, which I'd been reciting in my head ever since I'd seen it. I also pulled out my phone and snapped some pictures of the car. The man seemed a little thicker than the one from the grainy photo, but it was hard to tell. He had a similar body type. It might be him, I thought. Don't rule him out. I sat back and waited. My phone rang. It was my boss, Marcus, no doubt wondering where I was. I let it go to voicemail. I waited for half an hour, but the man didn't come out. After an hour, I figured he must work at the place. He wasn't just stopping by to deal with some insurance issue. He worked there. A quick Google search got me the police tip line for the murders. I called and told the woman who picked up about the Mazda, giving her the license plate and telling her I thought the man who drove it worked at the farmer's insurance office. She said they would look into it. As I hung up the phone, I felt like I'd done something good. I smiled as I started the truck and pulled out of the spot. By the time I got to work, that feeling had faded. The thought of working all day was about as attractive as getting a root canal. I wanted to be out there, finding more clues to give to the cops. I wanted to be making a difference, a real difference. But I swallowed my displeasure and headed in for another day of working up to my elbows in dirt and grease. I even apologized to Marcus for being late and let him ream me out a little bit, like a good employee. I set an alarm for 2:30 when Lily would be getting out of school. When the alarm went off, I took a break and called her, talking to her until she was home safely. She wasn't all that happy about it, but I made it clear she didn't have a choice. When quitting time came, I rushed out as fast as I could and drove straight over to the farmer's insurance office. The Mazda was gone. Cursing under my breath, I put my earbuds in and started listening to another podcast about the murders. I decided to drive to both previous crime scenes. I was closest to the second one, the mobile home, so I headed there first. There was a state police cruiser parked at the entrance to the property. I slowed as I passed, glancing out my window at the trailer home set a good distance back from the road. Several official vehicles were parked around it. The police were still searching for evidence. I turned around and headed the other way, toward the gas station where the first murder had taken place. While I drove, I looked for any sign of the silver Mazda, or any silver sedan that fit the bill. I also looked for any suspicious drivers or people who looked like the guy from the grainy picture. If the guy was smart, he would have already changed his appearance, which was why the guy in the Mazda was such a good lead, I thought. Easy to shave the beard off and leave the mustache, and to not wear a baseball cap. There was another state police vehicle at the gas station. I pulled into the abandoned station, thinking it wouldn't hurt to talk to the police officer. But before I even got out of the car, the guy was out of his and walking toward me. I went to open my door, but he yelled at me to stay in the vehicle, moving fast with one hand on his holstered weapon. I did as I was told, rolling down my window and trying my best to look friendly.
What do you want?
The officer said.
Don't tell me you're another goddamn podcaster.
No, sir, I said. I'm just a concerned citizen. I live here. Just curious how the investigation is going. He looked up at the sky, as if seeking help from the Almighty.
I can't comment on an ongoing investigation. Let me see your ID.
My ID? I asked, feeling a sudden flood of anger. Was this what the cops were doing? Sitting around watching empty buildings and harassing law-abiding citizens?
Yes. Let me see your ID, now.
Shaking my head and mumbling, I pulled my wallet from the center console and got my ID out. I handed it to the cop, who told me to stay put. He walked back over to his cruiser, using the radio attached to his left shoulder to talk to dispatch, no doubt seeing if I had a criminal record. While he waited for dispatch to get back to him, he wrote down my information on a clipboard. After several minutes, he walked back over and handed my ID back.
Don't come back here, okay? Not unless you have a good reason.
Good reason? I thought. A good reason? Catching a fucking killer isn't a good reason? But I didn't say anything. I just clenched my jaw as the officer turned to walk away. Then I found my voice.
I called in a tip earlier today about a silver Mazda. Do you know if they followed up on it?
He half turned toward me.
All tips will be followed up on. That's all I can tell you. Have a good evening, sir. And don't stop here again. We'll call a press conference when we have anything to share with the public.
I clenched my jaw again as he walked away. I gripped my steering wheel tightly and watched him walk back to his cruiser. When he got to it, he turned around and glared at me. I rolled my window up and turned around in the parking lot, fuming as I pulled back onto the road. A mini-movie played on the backs of my eyelids as I tried to sleep beside my wife. It started with Lily walking home from school alone. She looked so fragile and sweet as she took her time, enjoying the spring sunshine and the cool breeze. Then the sky went dark as the silver Mazda pulled up alongside her. It was as if I was walking on the street behind her, 50 yards back, and I yelled for her to run. I yelled for her to get away from the Mazda as quickly as she could, but she didn't hear me. I couldn't hear the words exchanged, but I watched in horror as my daughter stepped closer to the car, bending down to talk through the passenger window with a small smile on her face. I urged myself to run, but my legs felt encased in cement. I screamed, but my daughter still didn't hear me. She talked with the person in the Mazda for another minute, and even though I couldn't see him, I knew it was the man with the mustache and the cheap suit. Lily laughed and nodded and opened the passenger door. She got into the car, and it drove off, leaving me behind, struggling to run, to catch up with it, to stop it. Then the scene changed, and I saw my daughter in a decrepit room, bound and gagged. The man stood over her, knife in one hand. And although she was gagged, I could still hear my daughter scream as he started in on her. She screamed one word over and over again.
Daddy!
Gasping and sweating, I got out of bed and went to Lily's room. She was there, sleeping soundly. I stood there for a long time, watching her chest rise and fall with each peaceful breath. Then I headed to the home office and went over my notes again. I re-listened to some of the podcast episodes I'd absorbed the night before. I re-watched some of the YouTube videos, and I tried to put things together. But this time, instead of staying up until my wife woke up, I crept back into bed half an hour before her alarm was set to go off, and I pretended to be asleep. But I wasn't asleep. Far from it. I sat in the shopping center parking lot, waiting for the Mazda to show up. I'd already called in sick to work, knowing I needed to follow the Mazda man to see what he did after leaving work. I'd stocked up on snacks and drinks for the stakeout, and I had my pistol in the glove compartment, just in case. I even had an empty gallon jug I could pee in. But the Mazda didn't show up. Not around the same time it had yesterday. I was starting to think that my stakeout idea was a bust. But then I saw a Ford SUV pull into the parking lot and park at a spot near the insurance place. The man with the mustache got out of the SUV, wearing a different cheap suit, and walked into the insurance office. Why is he suddenly driving a different car? I wondered. Had he seen me following him yesterday? Did he get a heads up about the tip I called in? I brooded on these questions as the minutes turned to hours. After I went around and around in my head for 2 hours, I decided to listen to podcast episodes I hadn't heard before. It seemed that dozens of different true crime podcasts had covered the story. Most of the episodes covered stuff I already knew, but one of them talked about a possible cult tie to the murders. The guy didn't have any solid evidence, but he said he had been hearing strange things from a contact within the police department. I thought he was making stuff up to get listens and quickly dismissed the possibility of a cult. It was too fantastic. I snacked and drank Gatorade and a couple of energy drinks to keep me focused and awake. After all, I hadn't slept in 2 days. Then, around 2:20 p.m., the man came out of the insurance office and got into his SUV. I started my truck and followed him out of the parking lot. My throat thickened and my stomach clenched as he turned down the road toward the high school. School was just letting out as we arrived. I stayed well back from him, thinking that maybe this was all innocent. Maybe he was just picking up his kid. But he didn't turn into the designated pickup area, so neither did I. I followed him down a street flanking the school. He turned down the street and crept along toward a young black-haired girl walking alone down the sidewalk. My heart thudded in my chest. Was this really happening? Was he really the killer? His SUV hugged the curb as he came up next to the girl. She glanced up, then kept walking, picking up the pace. I was about 30 yards back when I saw him pull the SUV over. Although I couldn't see for sure, I assumed the front passenger window was down, because the girl suddenly stopped and turned, her mouth moving as she talked to the guy. She stayed on the sidewalk, a 3-foot expanse of grass between her and the SUV. I stopped my truck, unsure of what to do. The girl seemed defensive, but I knew if she took a step toward the car, I would have to do something. A bunch of scenarios ran through my mind. I could ram the SUV. I could pull in front of it and block him in. I could get my gun out of the glove compartment and hold him there, getting the girl to call the police. I pulled out my phone to call 911, but I didn't want to take my eyes off the girl. Suddenly, another girl came running down the sidewalk. She was blonde, her ponytail swinging as she ran. When she reached the black-haired girl, the SUV pulled away from the curb and sped down the street. I thought about calling 911 right then, but I decided it would be better to follow the guy some more. I took off down the street, passing the 2 girls. The blonde girl was hugging the other one, who had her phone out. As I passed, the black-haired girl raised her phone to her ear. I was sure she was calling 911. Good. That was the right thing to do. The killer had just tried to pick her up in broad daylight. I could see the SUV coming to a stop at an intersection ahead. I tried not to speed, knowing it would likely get me noticed. The SUV turned right. I reached the intersection several long seconds later and took the right. He turned back onto the main road and headed toward the shopping center with the insurance office. But instead of stopping, he passed by it. A couple of miles later, he turned into a neighborhood. I slowed as I made the turn, waiting for him to get far enough ahead that he wouldn't notice me, but not so far that I would lose him. When I turned into the neighborhood, the SUV was gone. Embers of panic flared to life inside me. I had him, and I let him get away. Slowing as I came to a cross street, I glanced left and right. No sign of the SUV. I sped to the next cross street and looked both ways. The street to my right was a cul-de-sac, and I saw a garage door going down over the back of the SUV. I turned onto the street and pulled to the curb several houses down. The garage door closed all the way. The SUV had been the only vehicle in the garage. No silver Mazda. Maybe he'd gotten rid of it, torched it, or had it destroyed in a crusher. I took pictures of the house and committed the address to memory. Expecting the police to pull up any minute, I stayed where I was. Surely those girls had gotten the license plate number. Surely they told the police. But when a couple of hours passed and no police showed up, I decided I would call in another tip. This time, I told them what I'd seen near the high school. I also made sure to tell them that I was the one who had reported the Mazda sedan the day before. They said they would look into it immediately. I hung up and waited, watching the house. 15 minutes passed, then 30, then an hour. Nothing happened. No police cars showed up to arrest the guy. Not even any detectives to question him. I watched until the sun went down, thinking the whole time of all the cases I'd ever heard about where the police had interviewed a serial killer months or years before they actually caught him. Whether it was because of a bureaucratic slip-up, poor police work, or poor communication between various police agencies, it seemed that the cops were only good at arresting serial killers after they'd dropped dozens of bodies. While I waited in the truck, I pulled my gun out of the glove compartment and held it in my lap. And I imagined the man in that house killing my daughter. That mini-movie played in my head over and over again. It was only interrupted by the insistent squawking of that woman calling me a murderer.
Murderer! Murderer!
I felt myself slipping, unable to stop the horrible images and sounds from playing in my head. When a headache seated itself between my temples, I realized I'd been clenching my teeth. For how long, I had no idea. I closed my eyes and shook my head. The urge to do something was almost unbearable. The guy was right there, in that house, and the police were doing nothing. I leaned my head against the steering wheel, finding a few moments of peace. But then the images of my daughter getting brutally murdered formed in my mind again.
Murderer! Murderer!
My phone rang, startling the horrible images out of my head. It was my wife calling. It was well after 7. I was supposed to be home by now. I let the call go to voicemail. This was more important. If I could nail the sadistic psycho who'd killed 2 innocent girls, my wife would understand if I missed one measly dinner. I put my phone on Do Not Disturb and continued watching the house, waiting for the police to show up. I didn't understand why they weren't there already, arresting the guy, searching for evidence. My body buzzed with energy. I couldn't sit still for another minute. I couldn't sit by and risk the man slipping out of the house unseen to kill again. Without really considering the possible consequences, I decided I would sneak around his property to see what I could see. Maybe I could find some sort of evidence that this was really the guy. Then I could call the police. Maybe they would listen to me then. I grabbed a navy blue hoodie from the back seat and pulled it on while still in the truck. I flipped the hood up and stuck my gun in the front kangaroo pocket. Thinking I would need my phone to call the police or take pictures of whatever evidence I found, I stuck it in my pants pocket, then got out of the car. Just as I was nearing the suspect's house, a car pulled into the cul-de-sac, forcing me to wait on the sidewalk as it pulled into the driveway of the neighbor's house. I smiled politely, gazing at the windows of the car, but I couldn't see inside. It was too dark, and the windows reflected the streetlights. When the car was in the garage, I continued to the suspect's house. But I couldn't make a move until the neighbor's garage door closed. So I kept walking, trying to act casual. Just a guy out for a walk. Never mind that it wasn't cold enough out for me to have my hood up. For a moment, I thought about abandoning my mission. I'd been seen. I could get in trouble for trespassing. I could be arrested. But then I thought of my daughter. My resolve strengthened as I heard her imagined cries for help in my mind. When the neighbor's garage door was closed, I turned around and hustled back to the suspect's house, ducking down the side of his garage toward a fence gate to the backyard. I slipped through the gate carefully, not making much noise at all. I only thought about a dog when I was in the backyard. I froze, waiting by the gate, listening for barking or the sound of rushing paws on grass. When several long moments passed without any evidence of a dog, I continued toward the back of the house. There was a softly glowing first-floor window, and I glanced through to see an empty bedroom. There was no furniture or paintings or anything. The door was open on the hallway, which was where the light was coming from. But all I could see of the hallway was a blank wall across from the open bedroom door. At the back of the house, there was a low wooden deck and a sliding glass door. I moved up to the door, which led to a dark kitchen and a dining room without a table. There was stuff sitting on the kitchen counters, bare essentials, but otherwise, it was undecorated, like the man had just moved in, or was getting ready to move out. I swallowed hard as I reached a shaking hand toward the door. A voice inside me said that this was crazy, that I wasn't a cop. I wasn't trained for this, that this was a stupid thing to do. But the imagined scenes of my daughter getting killed by this sicko loomed large, overpowering that voice. Besides, it was clear the police weren't going to do anything. What if he was about to leave town for good? What if this was what he did? He moved from small town to small town, killing a few girls in each one to satiate his dark appetites. How could I leave now, when I was so close to getting evidence that would put him away for good? I tried the sliding glass door. It opened. I stepped into the house, buzzing with fear and excitement, and slid the door closed behind me. The sound of a television came from somewhere near the front of the place. I listened for footfalls, but didn't hear any. Putting one hand on the gun in my hoodie pocket, I crept through the kitchen toward a small hallway that led to the front of the house. I came to an intersection in the middle of the hallway, looking down toward where the bedrooms were, including the one I saw from outside. I needed to find out where the guy was first. If he was watching TV, I could look for evidence in the bedrooms. Serial killers always keep trophies, don't they? So that's what I was hoping to find. I eased toward the sound of the TV, seeing the flickering blue light bouncing off the wall ahead of me. The living room entrance was on my left. I came to the threshold and poked my head around, seeing a recliner in the middle of the room with a side table next to it. The recliner faced a TV with a baseball game playing on it. The recliner faced away from me, so I couldn't see if anyone was in it. I eased forward toward the chair, my right hand sweaty against the gun in my hoodie. Just as I saw that the recliner was empty, I heard a scuffing sound and a grunt from behind me. I spun around just before a metal baseball bat hit me in the side of the head.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoy these stories, be sure to subscribe to the podcast and check out some more of my episodes here.